Go ahead. That must be it. Well, it's 6:30. I think we've got everybody here. City Council work session is going to come to order, and agenda item number 1 is budget best practices and goal setting.
Okay.
Laura?
With us this evening is Mr. Ben Hart from Allen Gibson Hulick and Mr. Derek Nielsen, also with Allen Gibson Hulick, and they are experts in this field, so I'll let them take it away from there.
I don't know that you can actually be an expert in budgeting, but we try. You guys do not have the privilege of meeting Derek Nielsen before when I talked to you guys about some of the budgeting best practice in March. Derek is actually with our organizational development group within Allen Gibson Hulick. Does a lot of facilitating all over the Midwest with various clients, most recently some in government on the East Coast. That we try to model a lot of what we talk about here today. Just as a reminder, just a little bit about me. Next year, I'll be 20 years in government. The first starting out on the dark side of auditing, and then I spent 15 years in Laura's seat with 2 other cities, and most recently going back to the private sector. I've spent my entire career in government, and completely believe in what we talk about, what we're talking about tonight. And it is, I can tell you, when I started in government 20 years ago, we weren't talking about outcomes, we weren't talking about priorities, we weren't talking about goals, much less budgeting best practices. We're talking about how do we make it to the next year. And that was the predominant conversation all summer long, how do we make it to the next year? And that was really a math problem. It wasn't a community-oriented, outcome-based problem, it was a math problem. And then that's where the accountants and the finance folks took over, and that's really how we derived the budget. What I'd like to talk about tonight, and that Cheryl's requested me to talk about, is budgeting best practices. And what I'd like to do is do a little bit deeper dive into really what we talked about before, revisit some of the information I presented to the city in March, so we can kind of get almost a fresh start, but then really dive further into what that really means, what those outcome-based budgeting means. And then goal setting. Goal setting isn't necessarily meant here as in we're going to ask you guys to facilitate tonight what goals mean to you. We are obviously going to ask for some input, but what I want to do is really set the stage for that conversation to take place down the road, a more extensive conversation to take place, which really means presenting more information tonight about what that really looks like. When we talk about best practice, when we talk about a budget, why is it not a math problem anymore? Why is it outcomes-based now? So just kind of a refresh, contrasting government from private sector to public sector. I think the most important factor here in my mind really here is the second bullet. It says on the private sector, resources expected to be invested, and in the public sector, resources reluctantly invested. There's more good to be done than resources available to do them. Obviously, we're living in a time of constraint right now, so there's almost a reluctance to make that investment because you know when you've made that investment, something else is going to have to be given as a sacrifice in order to make that priority happen. The challenge in government, on the left-hand side is where really we started. Line item budgeting, it was really statute and rule driven. We were talking about accountability for the conformance to rules, the rules meaning stay within your budget and we'll be good, to what we have today in some of the high power or the high performance governments when they're talking about mission and results directive to the department directors. They're a team and network driven. Accountability now comes to results for people, for citizens, versus accountability for spending. And then one of the new things that popped up is the choice and competition amongst governments where not just commercial entities land, but where residents want to move to. And what does that look like? high-performance governments, according to International City Management Association, have these things that they pay attention to on a regular basis. Most of them are focused on quality of programs. These are quality of the delivery on those programs. Early warning systems to say when an environment is changing and how do you react to that changing environment. If you have a corporation that comes in, so we want to put a headquarters in a certain location, do you have the infrastructure? Are you nimble enough to be able to direct infrastructure toward that corporation? Or even a plat of development for residents. Are you nimble enough to make that infrastructure, put that infrastructure in place? They're able to migrate strategies to weather those changing environments. So as the environments change, the strategies they've already set, they can revisit those strategies and say, how do they matter now? Do they change? Do we need a new decision and have that healthy discussion? Sometimes more than annual. Instead of a summer of budget discussion, it may be on a quarterly basis revisiting some of those inputs, if you will, some of those changing environmental issues. And then continuous improvement. Programs improve on a regular basis and always seek for that improvement, whether it's efficiency in the way we deliver service or an improvement in how we, say, improve a road. And then the prioritization is based on community values. What values are sitting out there? Why do we need this different approach? Obviously, some of this is review. We live in a permanent fiscal crisis, or do we? We know that property tax at some level isn't going to come back to the high growth it was before. Some of the housing infrastructure has changed. Residents aren't as easily, loans aren't as easily obtainable as they have been in the past. The cynical public can be on a federal or state level. It may not be on a local level. In fact, what I'm seeing now with our clients is a more willingness from residents to get involved in the local government because they're realizing that that's where they can make a difference. We just don't want that cynicism to focus down into that local government. The perception that at some level, whether it's a state or a federal government, is broken. Citizens don't receive the results for the taxes they pay. So if you stay on a line item basis, are you really delivering the outcomes that they expect, which we'll touch on. And then shifting the focus to delivering results at a price that they are willing to pay. And some of this is nationwide, the infrastructure, above ground infrastructure is an issue. So the current discussion taking place at the federal, state, and the local level right now is how do we continue to fund that? As roads fall apart or they start to decay, do we count on property tax? Do we dedicate a new revenue source toward that infrastructure? And what does that conversation take place? What does that conversation look like with citizens as they understand more about some of the priorities within infrastructure? How are you going to fund this? What are their options that they see? One of the quotes, this was back in 2002 as the state of Washington was going through, BFO is budgeting for outcomes. You'll see it's synonymous with the heading of this slide, the priority-driven budgeting. The usual political way to handle the projected deficit is to take last year's budget and cut. It's like